and I'm getting out. I'm going into the private sector. I'm not going to be doing this sort of work anymore. And of course, that's just very, very, very cheering. On the other hand, that's what people were put in jail for in World War I. And so the state doesn't like that. The state doesn't like people persuading its troops that they ought not to be doing what they're doing. But there are a lot of veterans, there are a lot of troops, and also we can never forget that Ron Paul got more donations from members of the military than all the rest of the Republican candidates, all other 7 candidates put together. So very interesting. So there are a lot of pro-peace people in the military. Can't give up on all of them by any means, and people can change their minds. And a lot of times people who have been in the military, I'm thinking of a father and a son. He was in Vietnam, and he pleaded with his son not to go into the Marines in Iraq, and his son did, and very badly injured. But they both are dedicated pro-peace people today, and I think there's evidence of more interest in peace, although I'll admit that it's still a tiny minority by, say, even Austrian economic standpoint. And there are very few, as I was saying to Bumper earlier, who are opposed to these wars, whether they're Republican or Democratic wars. Turns out that a lot of the Democratic pro-peace people weren't that at all. They were just anti-Republican war. And of course, now we're starting to hear George Will and people of that sort, just as I remember Tom DeLay in the 1990s sounding like a peacenik from FFF or LRC opposing Clinton's wars. Well, of course, DeLay was a total warmonger and monster when the Republicans came into power. But there are an increasing number of us, very small but increasing. I think it's a very powerful message. I would argue it's the message of religion as well as the message of economics. And I think we have right on our side. I think it's not a coincidence that we're not told that it's the war makers who are blessed.
Lew, just to follow up on your last question asker, I was in the Army when I started reading LewRockwell.com back in 2002 and 2003. But that's not the crux of my question. Just to let you know, hey, there are people that were in the military that have read it and still read it. But the crux of my question is that in the perfect anarcho-capitalist world, if that were to arrive, what is the view of items like national defense, where if other people were to invade, this country, if this were an anarcho-capitalist society, and as well as, is there a view, if you follow the Austrian School of Economics, do you have to be an anarcho-capitalist, or is there room for monarchism, or, like Dr. Paul is, a constitutional republic?
Well, I think it's a big tent. I mean, I think anybody who's opposed to the regime should be welcome. So whether they're minarchists, constitutionalists, anarchists, obviously I'm an anarchist, but I think I think we should, everybody should be welcome. On questions of national defense, take a look at the Hans Hoppe edited volume that's all online for free on the national defense and whether you need a state to run so-called national defense. Of course, if there were no, well, there would always be nations, because nations are not states. Nations are linguistic groups and other kinds of sorts of cultural formations. So I think his book is a very powerful argument as to why you don't need a state. But if you have a state, as he points out, as Rothbard pointed out, how do you decide what's the appropriate amount of national defense? I mean, you could potentially have a tank in every garage, right? I mean, you're going to potentially spend the entire income of every single American on so-called defense. Woohoo, the Martians may be coming as well as the Russians, so we have to protect against them too. I mean, I know there are people who advocate a vast increase in the NASA budget so they can shoot down asteroids that might be coming. Well, they can spend any amount of money. But I think that Hoppe and Rothbard and others, going back to de Molinari in the 19th century, and his work on the private production of security, show that it is possible for, we know that private companies are infinitely superior to the state in every other area of life, but somehow we think we need the Pentagon, or as I always think of them, the pentagram. No, we don't. We don't need that vast apparatus that's, not far from here. It's not, by the way, it's not, I don't want to shock anybody. They're not actually interested in defending you. They're interested in improving their power and their glory and their incomes and lording it over the rest of us. That's why people are in jobs in the Pentagon. These are not the average soldier in slogging in Iraq. These are the who was it who called them the perfumed princes of the military state? But anyway, these people, we don't, so I would argue we don't need a Pentagon. It is possible for private companies to provide defense. It's possible for private firms to provide policing. And of course there have been examples of this in the past. This is not science fiction in terms of the policing. And that we can, economic theory and libertarianism can show us that we do not need, in fact, we are positively harmed by the government being involved in so-called national defense. Because the government's not actually, it's part of the propaganda that in the private sector we're all caught up in our own nasty, selfish, private aims, just our own little lives. Thank God we have the government. The government which is concerned about the national good, the common good, the national defense. No, they're not. It's a parasitical entity living off the rest of us by force. And parasite can take our money and spend our money in any way we would allow them to. And then they can call it any number of different things, welfare and helping the poor and foreign aid and the list of thousands and thousands of expenditures. So I think, read Hoppe, also a very interesting paper that he did, and I apologize, I'm not remembering the name, but if you put Hoppe and insurance into the Mises search engine, come up with a very interesting paper on insurance companies as providers of defense. And one of the points he makes, and I'll stop talking about this in a second, one of the points he makes is that with insurance companies, there's other private companies running defense. If you were to have a quote-unquote war, the first thing they would do is try to kill the leaders of the opposing side. They would not seek to murder everybody in the opposing country and leave the leaders alone, which of course is the way it goes. The leaders like it that way. In fact, you'll find out they think it's an unbelievable outrage and a violation of the natural law that you might want to, in a war, go after the leaders of the opposing countries versus the poor schmoes in the military. So Hoppe demonstrates, I think, impenetrably and logically why in a private system, if there were to be a war, and this would be in fact an impediment to a war, that it would be far less costly, far more effective, just go after the leaders of the opposing side and leave the people alone. So if you've got to have a war, that's my kind of war. In fact, W.C. Fields got into deep trouble right before the outbreak of World War II when he suggested rather than having a war, he said, why don't we have FDR and Hitler slug it out in the Hollywood Bowl with sacks of dung. He didn't say dung, by the way. So that, and in fact, before the previous Gulf War, Saddam Hussein actually challenged George Bush to a duel. He said, why don't we have a duel? And the two of us fight it out, and that determined the war that way. Well, of course, Bush, needless to say, didn't want to go along with that. But anyway, to the extent that there would be a war, there would be any kind of international dispute, that's the way it ought to be handled, not just mass bombing of everybody in Nagasaki. That's murder, and it's uneconomic too. That's not the main argument against it. So see Hoppe and Rothbard on his work on war and on the anatomy of the state and these kinds of things, his great works. In fact, David Gordon's going to be, is editing right now a volume of Rothbard on war and considers a lot of these issues in Rothbard's writing, some of them unpublished. But we don't need the Pentagon. Don't need the Pentagon. Send them all to work at McDonald's, is my view, if they could get a job.
Sir, we have time for one more question.
Sir, you had asked first, did you?
Oh, no, let somebody else.
Okay.